Hello, Wake Up New Zealand, Carol Saker speaking. Well, I'm quite a collector of old books. I go to the Lions book fairs and pick up books for $1 that you can't buy in Whitcoulls or anywhere else, and into the hospice shops, etc. And I found some really interesting books. So what I do, I get the information from them, and then I go and research further. So I found this book, and it's authored by Sean Hendy. And it was authored in 2016. Now, Hendy, he worked at Auckland University. He was a director of Centre of Research Excellence, otherwise known as Pununa Matatini. So many of you might have heard of them. He publicly spoke out on radio, peer reviews. I mean, his footprints all over the place with this book. It can't be actually hidden. And he talked about criticisms, about funding, about scientists speaking out, either for commercial interests, government, etc., and how criticism of peers and being funded, how scientists were stopped from speaking out. So Hendy referred to Fonterra's botulism's debacle, how quickly the experts were actually rallied together by Ministry of Primary Industries, the government, and then they were made to sign non-disclosure agreements. So the public were left in the dark. He also referred to Fukushima disaster, saying that scientists had already warned about tsunami wave and what that could do, but that was ignored. Instead, they remained passive and there was no action taken, and science evidence just took it over instead of action. He was the recipient for the 2012 Prime Minister's Communication Award. He actually said that commercial sensitivity is an obvious barrier for scientists wanting to contribute to public debate. He also said about being required to demonstrate more impact from our work, shift away from basic research, particularly in Crown enterprises, institutes, that's government, towards industry-funded research. This is where he said experts were actually hitting constraints. They were being constraints because they were not allowed to talk up. He went on to point out, if you're a lone voice, you can easily be targeted and picked off and make what you're saying seem politically motivated rather than something that's motivated by concern about scientific evidence. Hendy said, I'd like to see a science commission that's independent of being government funded, but still answerable to Parliament, but not answerable to a government minister. So I went to Bridget Williams' Book's website where his book is advertised, and it's described here as, what is the duty of scientists in a crisis? To the government, to their employer, or to the wider public interest for information? But what if those objectives actually clash? In this book, it's penetrating text. Leading scientist Sean Hendy finds that in New Zealand, public obligation of the scientist is often far from clear, and that there have been some disturbing instances of scientists being silenced. So experts who have information the public seeks. Hendy speaks of his own experience when he said he finds these experts have been prevented from speaking out. So Hendy goes on to conclude that New Zealanders have a few scientific institutions that feel secure enough to even criticise the government of the day. On the 4th of November 2016, Spin-Off News. Sean Hendy was the author of an article in that newspaper, the title being, Are New Zealand's scientific experts really dead, or are they resting? He refers to the post-Brexit Britain. the failure to heed warnings of economists as to the risks of being in the EU that spawned many a think piece, and he referred to the death of experts, going on to say that experts may be forgiven for ending it all after British scientists that pointed at the moon and talked about the tides was accused of fear-mongering. He said that Britain once ruled the waves, but now finds itself ruled by folks who find waves a little confusing. He goes on to say, here in New Zealand, we know full well that the tides are caused by the decision of previous Labour government to extend daylight saving. He also wrote about Havelock North water, where 5,000 people became sick because of contaminated water. He said, our experts made themselves rather scarce. Did we have scientists who could speak knowledgeably on whether the contaminated surface water could have gotten into Havelock groundwater? That's what he asks himself. Then he responds himself and says, remarkably, science confirms that remnant populations of such scientists do still reside in New Zealand, but they work for the government. And as I wrote in Silence in Silence earlier this year, they are the sorts of experts we almost never hear from. Unfortunately, he said, the last thing a government scientist is allowed to do is to speculate about something that affects the public. He added, who needs an expert when helpful prime ministers can always find you another with a different viewpoint? So he finally concluded, if you are predisposed to think that science of tides was fabricated 400 years ago in preparation for Project Fear, then you may be tempted to dismiss these quality experts as having vested interest in spreading alarm in order to keep themselves employed. So spread alarm, spread crisis, then you will stay employed. You will get your funding from commercial government resources because these researchers actually rely on that. Obviously, Sean Hendy now he doesn't work at Auckland University anymore. So he's working for a climate innovation company called Toha, an impact investment marketplace to accelerate climate action in New Zealand for transformational change, collaboration with the government, iwi Maori business, academia, investors, and funders. How things change, eh? I will give you a bit more on about Sean Hendy because he opens the gates to what was actually happening back in 2016, 7 years ago. It was quite different. Wake up, New Zealand.